Hi, my name's Phil Clark. I'm the founder and managing consultant for Embedded IT, which is a technology procurement consultancy out of Southampton in the UK. And I've been tasked with pulling together a small project to try and analyse what's going on in the UK IT industry. And this is something that I actually presented to my local networking forum, which is the South Hants IT forum, and unfortunately forgot to press record on the Zoom call. So I'm rerunning this video session just for people to understand what goes on. The content of this presentation really summarises two things. One is what's going on in IT in the UK at the moment based on data that I've analysed, and I'll walk you through what that means, but also give some highlights on how complicated some of these big data projects can be. And certainly from my perspective, this has been quite a small project for big data, but has led to some considerable complexity, and I really just wanted to highlight how complicated these things are for other people who might be looking to embark on similar projects. So starting very briefly with a summary, problems with the video, summary of introduction to the project. So about 5 years ago, I started Embedded IT. The purpose of it was really to help clients find the right IT supplier from the UK IT industry. And obviously, there's a lot of IT suppliers in the UK IT industry. So trying to understand how to match clients to those suppliers. And clearly, there's lots of attributes that can be used to support that sort of matching process. Size of company, location, capabilities, etc., but also business model, focus on your industry. So I wanted to just really try and understand a bit more about all of the IT companies in the UK and find out attributes based on commonly accessible or publicly accessible data. And that proved to be a bit of a project. Summarised as mapping the whole UK IT industry, but to try and understand how the three layers of the supply chain, clients or buyers, the channel, which is your resellers, outsourcers, etc., and vendors all work together to support the IT industry in its current form. Realistically, I think I'd underestimated how complicated this was going to be. There is a lot of data out there and a lot of data not out there that makes this quite an obscure process to go through. And so the purpose of this presentation is to walk you through how that went for me and try and summarise some of the methods that I used, so people can see how it worked and some of the outputs that I found through the data. As a disclaimer, this is an informal project. This is one that I've done as a personal project rather than a work-related project. And so I'm still learning some of the technologies and the techniques to support big data projects. And therefore, there might be some inaccuracies in the data, but I think that's part of the cause in this sort of project. So just a little overview of what I actually did. So first off, I started looking at things like vendor partner portals to understand which companies sold which products, and that's okay. But if you look on a vendor partner portal, you obviously only get the view from that vendor of who's important, who's not important, etc. So I thought it'd be more interesting to start from a generic position, and I looked at Companies House, which is a UK government resource, to get a list of all of the companies in the UK, and then try and identify which ones classify themselves as IT companies. And armed with that, you can also extract information from Companies House about the directors and the shareholders of those companies. You can obviously get information about location, but what you can't get, interestingly enough at the moment, is a website link. And so if I wanted to look on multiple suppliers' websites to understand what they did, clearly that's not very helpful. So pulling the information about the company is a start point, but needed to understand how to get a website link. And the way I went about securing this is to use Bing, the Bing API or the Azure Search API, that basically you search for a company's name, and in the top 10 responses, you're likely to get their website if it exists. Now, that sounds very easy, and as a human, it's very easy to do a search and understand what the likely right answer is for searching for a company and finding their website. But in real terms, automating that is quite complex. And we had to look at matching scores and some fuzzy matching stuff that took a bit of time to get right. So that is probably the Bing API function, whereas it's very good in quite a significant portion of the cases. In some cases, it has found websites that probably aren't representative of an IT company, and we need to work through that process to iron out those problems. And then finally, once you've got a website, you can read it or scrape it to determine what a company does. So we went through a process of looking at all of the websites that we found and collating them into a repository to try and run some rules-based analysis on what each of those companies does. And again, because of the quality of websites and the quality of marketing buzzwords that describe what people do. That was a bit hit and miss as well. And I think one of the health warnings of this whole presentation is that the process is only as good as the inputs. And so people's websites need to be accurate for me to accurately assess what we think that company does. That said, if your website doesn't correctly articulate what you do, then to a large extent it makes a buyer's job very difficult. And so this in its own right could prove quite an interesting process to try and help companies understand the best way to position their websites so people understand what they do. This is a technology-based presentation, so I thought I'd give you a little overview of what we're using from an architectural perspective. Again, very informal architecture. I work with some very close friends on a non-paid basis to try and pull this together. I don't have all the skills in these products myself, but working with my friends, I managed to get an architecture together which comprised MySQL for the structured data, MongoDB for the unstructured data, running under Docker on my home PC, Solr or Lucene, which is a search engine that sits above MongoDB in my instance, to allow quick searches for certain text fields and those sorts of things. Loads and loads and loads of Excel and CSV files and JSON files. So the data aspects of this is difficult because of the volume of different formats and constantly converting between these different formats. And one of the things I learned as part of this process is that understanding your data architecture is absolutely critical, because if you haven't got the data in the right place, or if it's the wrong format, or it's got low quality, then clearly the outputs aren't going to be as good as you really need them to be. For an output perspective, I use Power BI. Cracking bit of software from Microsoft, largely because it was free, so easy to plug in. Also has some good plugins to some of the database engines that I mentioned previously. It has its limitations, and I think anyone who's taking these sorts of projects more seriously probably have different options available to them in terms of BI architecture to leverage the data as best they can. And in terms of the inputs, we used a Python front end to take outputs from the various places on the left in green there, to try and manipulate the data to get it into a structured form. So there's quite a lot of Python scripts running that manipulate CSV files or API outputs, excuse me, to get into a structured form for the data to be useful. But yeah, ultimately pretty straightforward, all running on my home PC, so all very straightforward to use, and hopefully going forward, if we take this project more seriously, we'll look at an architecture that's a bit more formal and a bit more structured with appropriate infrastructure beneath it to make it work better. So why I'm actually doing this, so Embedded as a company's remit really is to try and help the IT industry work together. We see ourselves as sort of relationship counsellors in a complex world. And I started on the back of that as a website called the Embedded Directory, which is really intending to help buyers find IT companies. And my frustration with this whole process was that as a buyer, it's very difficult to know who your local IT companies are. If you use things like Google or some of the vendor portfolios, the vendor websites, it's almost impossible to try and find anyone other than the big companies out there. So I thought it'd be useful to try and map the whole industry and then serve that information up to buyers so they can find a IT company that's an alternative to the big brands, and maybe support local business, or drive better pricing by working with more appropriate companies than some of the big guys. So I created the Embedded Directory that supports that structure, and I've populated with around about 2,500 companies already. But from the first pass of the analysis I've done, there are 353,000 IT companies in the UK, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. And so I'm clearly only scratching the surface of what's the IT industry currently looks like in the UK. The other reasons why I want to do it a bit more personal, I really wanted to, I'm a computer science degree holder, but I've forgotten all of the technology stuff. I've spent most of my time in commercial management of IT contracts and IT services. So I want to just get my fingers dirty again with some of the technology, so coding for Python and things like that. So I quite fancy playing with that. The other thing is there's obviously a big industry around big data, data intelligence, artificial intelligence, etc. So I wanted to just see how complicated this stuff is, and the conclusion is it's really complicated. So lesson learned. But I think there's a lot of value that can be extracted from these sorts of projects, and it's important to try and get to a position where if you understand how to take this forward and you think data is a big differentiator in your industry, then getting a knowledge of what can be done with that data is pretty critical. And so from an embedded IT strategy perspective, I thought it'd be useful just to make sure that if we did have the data that supported a view of the IT industry, then clearly understanding how to leverage that data would be useful at a business level. The final point is I'm a bit of a geek. I love all this stuff. I absolutely love technology. So I find all this very interesting. So using technology to look at the technology industry was pretty much ticking most of my boxes. And so, yeah, I've very much enjoyed this whole project, albeit a little bit frustrating in places. And what I'm trying to achieve is a number of things. For all of the IT suppliers in the UK, and to be really clear what I mean by this, it's really trying to focus on those that are resell or in the channel, not necessarily manufacturers or developers of software, but really people who own IT companies, and their role is to help clients implement technology to support a business process. So I'm trying to find out just demographic stuff. Where are they? How old they are? Interested in some of their ownership stats, which directors own which companies is useful for a number of positions. I'll explain that in a minute. Also, what vendors they support. It's very, very difficult without looking at individual websites to understand what a company can do. And most people say they do Microsoft, but if you wanted to find someone who does Microsoft and another vendor, then actually, doing a search for those sorts of companies is quite difficult to achieve. And certainly things like search engines like Google, incredibly good at what they do as a broad brush approach to the internet, but trying to find niche companies or specific requirements beyond general searching is quite difficult to use Google for. So just trying to understand how to pull together a view of what vendors and also what accreditations a company has. Are they a Microsoft Gold partner? Are they a Juniper partner? Are they do they have ISO 27001? Finding those sort of things out from the website content was really part of the design thought that went behind this. The next sort of layer down, which is in yellow because I haven't quite cracked it yet, but I'm on the way to do so, is who they sell to. So if you look at a company's website, do they have a number of case studies in the healthcare industry or education? So trying to ascertain as a company who they focus on at a vertical level. And also where on the stack they sit. There's quite a lot of people who are either networking or end user compute or applications. And it's probably quite useful to understand where their bias is or where their strengths are around specific technology solutions. So you can match clients who are looking for end user compute to people who focus on end user compute rather than those that just have mentioned Lenovo a few times on their website. And the final point, clearly how big they are. Now there is information in Companies House that allows you to ascertain how big they are at an accounting level, at a high level. Anyone over £10 million turnover have to submit a certain type of accounts to Companies House. But beneath that, which is clearly a significant portion of the industry, it's quite difficult to ascertain financials without going to a credit checking agency. And I haven't done that for a combination of reasons. One is it costs a bit of money and I didn't want to do that. And secondly, I want to make sure that I was getting enough value out of the rest of the project before I went down that route. But I think going forward, it's useful from a buyer's perspective to understand things like financial strength, turnover, etc., to ascertain both risk associated with buying from that company, but also you wouldn't want to be giving a £10 million project to someone who turns over £100,000. So just trying to make sure you match up project requirements appropriately to turnover. And the final two in red, because I haven't really cracked this at all, I would dearly love to collate how good they are, which is very subjective and quite difficult to assess clearly. And I think that clearly is down to things like ratings and reviews, which obviously Google have cracked, and a number of other comparison sites have cracked. And I'm just trying to work out how best to do that, because I think that will take quite a lot of customer interaction and some of the processes to support curation of that data and making sure it's accurate and not defamatory is something that I'm trying to get my head around at the moment. And the other thing is how big they are. The number of employees isn't stored on Companies House. It is stored elsewhere on the internet. Certain places like LinkedIn have this sort of information, but trying to make sure that you get the right level of information rather than just one particular website's view of it is key here. And I'll need to think about that a bit more readily to ascertain whether it's accurate or not. But fundamentally, these are the sort of questions I'm trying to ask of an IT supplier or in the industry. For each company, what do they do? What sort of company are they? And therefore, who would like to buy from them, to try and give them that advice. So diving into the data a little bit, we have a hierarchy of data. And to give you an idea of scale, in the UK, there are about 4.8 million companies, including dormant companies. So this is all companies registered to the UK as provided by Companies House. And if you look at each of those companies, they all come with what is called a standard industry classification, or SIC code. And you will see SIC code in this presentation quite a lot. And it defines what each company does. So a company such as mine is registered as a 62020 SIC code, which is an IT consultancy, and therefore it's clear from Companies House, you can see that I am an IT consultancy company. by looking at those SIC codes, you can use that to really try and narrow down which companies do what. So IT companies generally fall across 3 SIC codes. 61 is primarily telco, 62 is primarily IT functions, and 63 is a combination of other IT related and telco related services. So for the purposes of this presentation, have focused very much on SIC code 61, 62 and 63. And so I've extracted those companies from the 4.8 million, and there are 353,000 companies in the UK that do IT in that definition. And I appreciate there are other SIC codes that are relevant to this process, but for the purposes of this presentation, I've stuck to those 3. If you then take it down the next level, those 353,000 companies, only about 272,000 of those are active, i.e. some of them are dormant and therefore have registered at Companies House that is the case. And some of them aren't necessarily limited companies as such, they are other sorts of corporate vehicles. And so narrowing down an active IT company is about 270,000, which is a big number, clearly difficult to navigate if you're trying to work out which one the right one to work on is. But if you get through the big number side of things, there's good reason why that might be the case. And in some cases, lots of people as individuals register limited companies for the purposes of earning as a contractor, and so that's valid, and they would still come up in that search that I've just described. And there are other reasons why there might be companies in existence that we just need to try and filter out as part of this process, and I'll come on to that in a minute. Running through my Bing process, I managed to find around about 35,000 websites. Now, I haven't searched all 273,000 active IT companies for this. Basically, at this point in time, I've got to about 35,000 websites that I believe are representative of an IT company. But the reason why I've stopped at 35,000 is because I just want to make sure that that data is valid and my process for finding an IT company's website is accurate and therefore usable. So in simple terms, the data that's later on in this presentation that's relevant to website content is looking at 35,000, roughly 35,000 websites in total from companies, and that equates to 15.3 million web pages, which is mental. And one of the things I was really surprised about is that the volume of pages on people's websites is something else. 437 pages on average per site, which is clearly, as a usability perspective, very, very difficult to find. And I don't believe many of these companies have got such a broad range of solutions and technologies that they have that volume of stuff on their pages. Now, again, health warning, some of the websites that I was looking at obviously are, in some cases, e-commerce sites, and they have thousands of products, and they might be represented by an individual page per product. So in that instance, maybe the counts get a bit skewy. But fundamentally, this feels like a big number, and it's quite difficult to try and ascertain the right answer to that. And for those of you a bit on the technology side, 15.3 million web pages is about 120 gig of data. So it's quite a big lump to be playing with in database terms, which makes the whole process quite interesting from a technology perspective. Just on the people involved, in total in the UK there are 8.2 million people who are down as shareholders. That's not a discrete number, that's a total number of shareholders. So there might be some duplicates in that. And in IT companies it's about 500 million people. So round numbers, it's about 1.5 people per shareholders per company. In terms of directors, Companies House doesn't give a total view of the directors for all companies, but for IT companies I've managed to establish there's about 800,000 directors of IT companies, i.e. people who've got control of that company, and therefore about 2.5 to 3 people per company on average. So the metrics are quite interesting. I think it makes it easy to try and draw rules and boundaries around what we're looking at, and try and to drive through the data a little bit to try and ascertain what goes on. So all UK companies, in short, what this graph is telling you, it's a very busy graph, apologies, it is looking at all of the companies in the UK, the 4.3 million companies, what do they actually do? And this is based on the SIC code. Now, I've mentioned SIC code before, Standard Industry Code, and it basically gives you a very clear view of what a company does. So at the top, other business support services activities, people have registered their company to do those sorts of supports, and that could be virtual assistants, it could be all sorts of things, secretarial studies, etc. Individuals or companies that represent those sorts of services are by far the biggest lump, 5.66% of all of the 4.3 million companies. IT companies are prominent at they get to about number 5. So about 146,000 companies are IT consultancy activities, such as embedded IT. And I think the reason why this is quite a large number is because there are a lot of what is known as personal service companies. So people who are individual contractors who've started limited companies for the purposes of engaging with clients to provide contracting services. Doesn't necessarily mean they're an IT company or a business that does IT. It's more at an individual level. So one of the problems I've had to try and get my head around is how do you filter out some of those companies from the work that I'm doing. More interesting as well, some of the 68 to 09, the third down companies, a similar sort of thing. I think there's quite a lot of companies that have been set up for the purposes of managing either tax affairs or getting the right structure around some of the assets you've got. So other letting, operating of own or leased real estate. Clearly in the UK there are some tax advantages to putting property that you own within a limited company structure to support appropriate tax treatment. So I think a lot of these companies are registered for the purposes of ensuring that the right tax treatment is applied to various revenues. And that's one of the problems we've got with the data is it's quite difficult to tick a little box to say I've started this company without a real intent to create a business, just really for the purposes of creating a vehicle on which certain revenues can be acquired. And if you look at the sort of overall view, so raise it up a little bit of a level, the first two digits of a SIC code give a broad headline to which industry you're in, and real estate is massive in that regard. Interestingly, retail, clearly there's lots of shops in the UK, so they're sort of second biggest. We mentioned business support and head office activities, which is really group companies, etc. And then IT is the 5th biggest sector in that regard. Interestingly, telco, so the 61 code, doesn't really appear on the list in terms of the top 10, top 20, and the 63 code is even smaller. So it makes interesting reading that IT is such a big part of the UK company by volume of company, not by revenue, but by volume of company. So really important to make the distinction. I'm counting companies here, not counting value to the economy or those sorts of things. Bit of sort of light humour around some of the things I found. There are 350 companies that still sell wholesale audio tapes, records, CDs and videos. So, interesting business model. I don't know if that's just that they fancy competing what was Blockbuster, but good luck to them. There are 295 companies that claim to clean chimneys. Now, in my opinion, I would have thought most chimney sweeps are individual sole traders, but fundamentally there's 300 companies that are cleaning chimneys for a living, and there's loads of other things you can find in this data as well. 70 companies raise camels or camelids. So it's interesting in its own right, looking through the Companies House data, just to see the full breadth of companies that there are in the UK, and what a diverse industry we maintain, which is great. Now, little note on the data. I mentioned SIC codes, and a company can have up to 5 SIC codes, and quite a lot of people have more than one SIC code. But the problem is there's a bit of an eclectic mix, and I've redacted the screenshot here, but fundamentally there is a company further up north from where I'm sitting, so I'm in Southampton, so it doesn't get much further south than here, which have claimed that they've got these 4 SIC codes. They grow vegetables and melons, roots and tubers. They sell freshwater aquaculture. They manufacture other products, wood, manufacture of cork, straw and plaiting materials, and they are an IT consultancy. And from a data perspective, it's very difficult to unpick this. Trying to understand, based on Companies House data, whether a company is genuinely an IT company, you can't rely on SIC code as the only indicator. Now, clearly, if the only SIC code a company's got is an IT one, then that's a very clear indication. But in this instance, it's a great example of how a fairly diverse business who can both grow vegetables and perform IT consultancy exists, and we as a company, for this project, needs to, is this really an IT company? We need to establish whether that's the case or not, because it might be that their primary function is delivering IT consultancy, and they just so happen to have a very niche focus around agriculture, aquaculture, and furniture manufacture. So there's some thought needs to be go into this project. For the purposes of this exercise, I've focused very much on what I call the primary SIC code. So this is where the first SIC code on the list is an IT SIC code. And if you look at this breakdown, you can see of all the primary SIC codes against the companies that I've got that are in the 61, 62 or 63 range, the split is sort of a reasonable bias towards IT companies. So the yellow block here, 44% of all companies are IT consultancies, 17% are other IT service activities, and then you've got some business and software development companies as well. So over 75% of the 61, 62 and 63 SIC codes are IT companies by definition. And the telco side of things is a bit smaller than I was expecting. You see the SIC code for wired telecommunications activities was 61100 or 61200 for wireless are relatively small of the overall size of this pie. So it sort of goes to show that IT is a bigger portion by volume of company, not by revenue, than a bigger portion than telco. And therefore, you could sort of make some assumptions around how that plays through in terms of revenues going forward. The other thing is I think telco can be a bit more niche. IT companies are quite broad brush. Telcos have to have specific skills around networking and voice and data. So it's a slightly different industry, but it generally is lumped together. And for the purposes of the directory, I'm trying to pull together a list of companies that are IT and telco. So I'm trying to make sure I've got an accurate view of that. Now I've mentioned you can have more than one SIC code. You can have up to 5 SIC codes. As mentioned before, this is primarily on the first SIC code. But just to give you an idea of how things combine, most companies, 76% of companies, have only got one SIC code. It makes my life really easy. So it's good that I can narrow down quite quickly for 75% of the data I've got what they actually do. The remaining 25% are probably need a bit more analysis. There are 20 companies that have got 5 SIC codes, and the rest of them have got more than one. So health warning, some of the SIC code analysis I've done is not considering the non-primary SIC code, and therefore it needs a bit of tidying up going forward. And if you look at the other SIC codes, the non-IT SIC codes in the IT company estate that I'm looking at, nothing really surprising there. You can see the distribution here of management consultancy, advertising agencies for web designers, retail for people who sell IT. And so there's lots of other SIC codes that people have associated with an IT SIC code that makes it obvious what they actually do, which is great. The only one that I really struggled with was artistic creation. I don't really know what that SIC code represents, and I think realistically that's probably more around web design or the art side, the creative side of IT from a graphic design side of things. So be interesting to see how that plays out, and I'm going to do a bit more analysis on that going forward. But this is the breadth of the sort of different SIC codes that people associate with IT companies. So the next sort of cut of the data I took was really looking at the shareholders, and it's sort of not that interesting really if you are want to keep this relatively high level. But my interest was really just trying to understand some of the people behind the companies, and obviously shareholders are the owners of the companies rather than the directors of the companies who tend to manage day-to-day activity. But ownership of the companies is an indication of how diverse we are as a culture, and I thought it'd be interesting just to do a little bit of assessment about how these things look. And so in total, of the IT companies that I have extracted from Companies House, there are around about 434 shareholders of IT companies. And it's slightly different to the numbers previously quoted. It's a slightly different cut of the data, but fundamentally just looking for patterns and trends. So on the left-hand side, a big table, apologies, it's quite a busy slide. You can see a breakdown of the nationalities of IT companies. And the lovely thing about this is obviously you've got a major proportion of British and English nationalities, but there's such a big diverse range of different countries or people from different nationalities that have invested in our IT industry. And I think that's reassuring to see that we have such an international base of people who are willing to invest money in the UK IT industry. And that diversity, I think, is key and needs to continue, not getting into the intricacies of some of the changes in politics going forward. Country residents, nothing really surprising there. The majority of people are in England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. And you'll see it's a relatively small portion of non-resident, UK resident people who are running, or sorry, are owning portions of our IT company. So United States being the first non-UK country country of residence that's represented by this data. So nothing really to say there. The other thing, which might be a bit difficult to see on the video, but the pie charts at the bottom are a really silly bit of analysis I did around first name and second name. So this is first name of a shareholder and surname of a shareholder. And the reason why I did it was just because the data was there and thought there might be something interesting in there. And as it transpires, there is a few things that actually jump out at you. The first thing on the surname analysis, actually it's really good that we've got a good mix of ethnicity in the context of surnames. And I appreciate it's more complicated than this. And there are other indicators, but if you look for some of the more ethnic surnames such as Patel, Khan, Singh, they're in the top 10 of all surnames. So this shows that we've got a broad, diverse ethnic mix of people involved in UK IT companies, which is greatly reassuring. And for the purposes of sort of normalization of the data, I actually pulled a list of the top 10 UK family names from the internet. I can't credit them because I can't remember where I got it from. But you'll see that the bulk in the top right-hand corner, the bulk of the surnames are traditional English, Scottish, Welsh names that are most prominent in the UK. So it's nice to see that we've not just conformed to the total population view, and we've actually got some nice blend of different surnames and therefore ethnicities, big assumption, but ethnicities on that basis. The other thing, looking at the first names, is that actually there's a real lack of diversity in gender. If you look at the top 20 names we've got here on this company, David, Andrew, etc., they're all male names. And if you go through the list, the first lady's name that I could find on the list was Sarah. She's at position 53. So, and she's got, she individually has got 0.52% of the first names of shareholders. Now, out of 434,000 people, you would expect a reasonable proportion to be female. And it looks like a significant shareholding is held by the male side of things. Now, that's probably understandable because for the last 20, 30 years, IT has been very much a male-dominated industry, and we should be trying to address that at this point in time. But I thought it was interesting just to sort of see from an ownership perspective, we've got an issue around lack of diversity of gender in terms of shareholders. So that's just something that nothing you can do about it. But I think over time, and the intention is to redo this work in maybe a year's time, just see if we've balanced that out a little bit, if that's changed at all. Ages, pretty uninteresting graph this. The average age of shareholders of IT companies is 45, just under 46, and the average age of people in the UK is about 40. So realistically, didn't really get anything out of this. Nice distribution. Clearly there are shareholders that are older than retirement age, that's good. And we've got some young people involved in shareholding of IT companies as well, down at the ages of 18 to 20. So it's a nice distribution, but it's nothing really to write home about in terms of data content here. Now, I talked about one-man bands. Looking at the data, it's quite interesting to try and ascertain what is the definition of a one-man band. And I'm using a colloquial term here to try and represent someone who started a limited company to be a contractor. And so trying to understand how best to weed those out of my data. And of the 353,000 IT companies I previously mentioned, 123,000 have got one director, 190,000 have got one shareholder. So, and I did a bit of analysis, 110,000 of those have got one director and one shareholder, which is the minimum amount you need for ownership of a company in the UK. So on that basis, I think realistically, I'm going to assume that one director and one shareholder is a one-man band. And there is further analysis I can do to compare the names of the director and the shareholder to see if they are the same person. And also expand that out a little bit to say, if you've got a director and two shareholders, if those two shareholders have the same surname, the chances are they're husband and wife or father and son, and therefore more likely to be a smaller family-owned limited company for the purposes of doing contracting work. So a bit more work to do to try and iron this lot out. But a reasonable portion, I think, and I'm guessing around about 200,000 of the 353,000 companies will be personal service companies, companies with an individual who's using it for contracting purposes. So company's house data, and there's lots more we can extract from it, but fundamentally I just pulled a few of those things out. The next sort of phase of the process was try and look at web scraping. Now, web scraping has got some interesting emotive terms around it, and I accept it's not everyone's cup of tea. I think providing it's done with respect and ethical outlook on life, but fundamentally web scraping is all right. And there's clearly you're not allowed to copy data for the purposes of making money out of it. But if you're looking at data to try and extract content and perform aggregation and trends, do a bit of analysis, I think that's okay. And from a legal perspective, I think that's defined as fair use, and I'll come on to that in a minute. What we actually did was pointed a web scraper at the content of the websites that I've mentioned. So 35,000 websites, we pointed a web scraper at it to extract the text. And is that the same as reading the website? Pretty much. I mean, the only difference is that you don't get the context or the imagery. So we have just got the words that are on these websites, which clearly gives us a lot of data in its own right. but it does make it difficult to assess what goes on because of the context that comes from seeing an image on a website over and above just text. Now, on the left-hand side here, you've got Computer Centre's website, and to give you an example, clearly the top banner there, Met Office, Adapting Supply Chain, etc. You can see that that's a industry-related specific project that this company have done, supporting cloud-based services in the Met Office. Great case study for Computer Centre. Fundamentally, if you scrape that page, you'll see adapting the supply chain from traditional physical infrastructure, etc. So you'll only see the text, and it's very difficult if you take that text and stick it amongst all the other text on that page to identify that as a key item. And this is where natural language processing comes into its own. So artificial intelligence has a number of different ways you can use data or analyze data, and some of the NLP tools, the natural language processing tools, will allow you to find emphasis from a piece of text. So adapting the supply chain from traditional physical infrastructure to cloud-based services, if you ran that through an NLP classifier to rank the relevance of each of the words, it will probably draw out the supply chain and cloud-based services and physical infrastructure are the key components of that sentence. And so you can do some clever things around prioritizing or weighting the content within a page by using NLP techniques. We, to a limited extent, did do this. The issue we found was that the actual process of running NLP through this, through the sheer volume of data that we had, meant it's quite difficult to try and extract it, and also it was taking a very long time. So I think going forward, if this project gets any legs, then we'll probably use NLP more readily to get more value out of the data that we've got. But for the purposes of the remainder of this presentation, we're really just looking at simple text, keyword phrases, and understanding that. I think the other thing that, just to walk through what we actually did, so we took the results of the Bing search and pointed a scraper at that site. Now, we did do some analysis of what came back from the Bing search, but if you Google embedded as a good example, you will get a lot of hits for not my company, and clearly my company is Embedded IT. If you Google Embedded IT Limited, or Bing Embedded IT Limited, you'll get Companies House. So finding a balance of getting the right website returned from the search results is a piece of work that needed to be done, and we did a lot of testing, and the end result has been for every search that you perform on the Azure API, you get 10 responses, and trying to ascertain which one the right response is was quite an art. We did something called fuzzy matching, so you look at the company's name and try and match it to the web address, the URL, the domain. So if Embedded IT comes back with embedded-it.co.uk, then that's a good match. If Embedded IT comes back with companieshouse.gov.uk/embedded IT, then it's not such a good match. So it's really, we had to put in place a process to try and ascertain the right answer to that. We then took all the text in a native form, which I've already spoken about, from that site. We then looked at indexing all of that text, 15.3 million pages, based on some specific inputs. And these inputs are evolving, but at the moment we looked for 411 vendors to try and find out which ones were most readily mentioned. We looked for accreditations, and that's a combination of things. So that is for someone partner, so Microsoft partner or IBM partner. It's just to see how many people claim to be different partner types. And also we looked at the ISO type range as well. So 27001, 14001, those sorts of ISO accreditations. And it's really interesting what came back from that. And the final thing we did, and I don't even know why we did this, we thought it'd be interesting to try and use what's called regular expressions to identify something that's got an email address on it. And not for any reasons that we're going to use the email addresses to try and approach anyone. Really more this is to do with how much contact data is available on these sites. And obviously people have got contact us at domain name, but there are 480,000 email addresses in the data we had, which is a fair indication of how loose people are with their email addresses on websites. And so I think, lesson to the wise really, if you are creating a website and you don't want your email to be scraped, don't put it on your website. Obviously it's very easy to find an email address based on general pattern matching, if it's got an @ sign in it and it's got a full stop at the end. Like I say, the data in its own right is safely protected. We're not doing anything with it from a GDPR perspective or doing anything with the emails. It was really just an intellectual exercise to see whether we could find how many people put their email address on websites. Interesting. As I've explained, had some problems with this. Only a small percentage of the sites are not technology sites, but that's because we couldn't get the right sites out of Bing. Finally, the scraper did have a few problems. And so, some of the sites didn't scrape correctly, and we've discarded that. But we think we're in the sort of 90% accuracy mark, and I'm trying to work on some processes at the moment to try and make that more accurate. Now, I did get challenged on this process about the legality of web scraping, and I think my position is that by default this is not illegal, providing you are using the data for fair use. And what I mean by that is you're not commercially capitalizing on any of the specific data scraped, you're not copying it and searching it and selling it in totality, and you're not breaching terms of service. And what I mean by terms of service is most websites have got terms of service written into their legal terms. So basically, if you go on someone's website, by default you are conforming to their terms of service, or you're in breach of contract. And we've done quite a little bit of work to try and make sure that we avoid sites that don't want to be scraped. There are technical ways you can avoid being scraped. So there's something called the robots.txt file, which when you're scraping, you read the contents of that file, and if it says don't scrape me, we didn't scrape it. So if you are a provider that has got robots.txt set up on your website that said don't allow scrapers, then we haven't touched your website. But fundamentally, if you haven't done that safeguard, then the terms of service is the only other way you can protect your site from being scraped. And we clearly, because we needed to look at this content, we didn't know that the terms of service was going to be saying yes or no to scraping until we scraped the site, sort of ironically. So I've done a sort of historical search of the content that I've got, the 15.3 million web pages that I've got. Only about 2,500 use the term data scraping or web scraping. So I think it's highly unlikely that many people have got terms of service that say they do not want data scraping or web scraping occurring on their site. And interestingly, if you look at the actual pages that refer to those phrases, most of them from other IT companies that sell web or data scraping services. So clearly this is a lot more prominent than just me doing it, and I have no intention of commercializing the data. And therefore, I think it's okay from a fair use perspective to use this to just do some aggregation and trend analysis. The other reasons why you wouldn't want your site to be scraped is clearly if you've got a database that holds secret data or trade information, and we've gone nowhere near that. That makes you a hacker. You should not touch any of that sort of stuff. And interestingly, there was a recent court case between a major social media firm and another firm where it was actually deemed okay to scrape the social media's firm's data because it wasn't behind a password mechanism, and therefore that social media firm has now fixed their service to mean you have to log in to access the data, because that makes it a lot more secure, and obviously it's pretty clear that you're breaching some sort of problem if you've gone through someone's password to scrape data. And the final thing that we've been very sensitive to, and clearly in the context of denial of service, if you scrape a website so often that it clogs up a service, it's just not right. You can't be scraping this every 10 minutes to see what's changed. And in real terms, the change volume on some of this data is pretty low. So we scraped a site probably a maximum of 4 times in the last 6 months. We tend to do it overnight from a UK hours perspective. So hopefully we haven't caused any impact on anyone's data. So it's a big area. There's lots of nuances and differences to this. I have a lawyer who thinks I'm okay, but fundamentally, if anyone wants to engage in that conversation, then I'm not that keen to do so because I'm no legal expert. So onto the data. So actually, from a vendor's perspective, I thought it was quite interesting. There's no surprises, although there are a couple of sort of nuances that probably need ironing out. The top use of a vendor name is Google, as you probably would expect, because these are all internet-based services, and that could be a combination of someone being a Google partner, or they are using the phrase Google, such as Google this phrase on their web content. And so, pinch of salt, maybe Google isn't quite as popular as Microsoft. There's not much in it, but I would say that Google clearly very prominent, and some later slides will show you Google partner stats as well. Microsoft is mentioned 10,000 times or 9,600 times out of the 35,000 supplier sites. So all of these figures are a percentage of the 35,000 suppliers that we managed to look at, and obviously 9,000 people claiming to be something to do with Microsoft is interesting. A third of the industry, and I would question whether that many people are genuinely Microsoft partners, and there's probably some mileage we can take on that to just see whether people are mentioning Microsoft or talking about being a Microsoft partner. A bit of a sort of nomenclature problem. Sharp, clearly a big vendor of all sorts of equipment with regards to technology. also has a brand that gets mixed up in general English phraseology. So if there are people saying there's a sharp light or a sharp suit or a sharp knife, that would get mixed up in the use of this data with Sharp the brand. And part of the issue, clearly from a data perspective we've got with this, is trying to identify Sharp as a brand versus Sharp as a general word, which we need to work on. And that's going to be interesting as we work through that. And again, that's probably where NLP comes into its own. And the other thing that surprised me was Zoom is a lot more prominent than I imagined. Now, bearing in mind, this data was probably extracted through the course of August this year. And so Zoom, is now a lot more prominent than it was maybe a year ago. And people are probably making reference to the fact they've got webinars running on Zoom. But it was interesting that 4,200 of the 35,000 companies that we looked at had made a mention of Zoom. And I don't think that's a mix-up with the word Zoom in English language. I think realistically this is reference to Zoom vendor. So we're going to dive into that a little bit and see why that is the case. And another problem with my data is, we searched for AWS and we searched for Amazon Web Services, but we didn't combine those things. So most vendors who are in the world of cloud probably have got some partnerships with either AWS or Amazon Web Services, the same company, but they use different phraseology to explain who they work with, and we haven't rationalized that data. So there is a process which uses synonyms, where you can merge different phrases to identify pages and data associated with different terminology. And so we're going to look at that over the course of the next few months to try and make sure we iron out those sorts of problems. Vendor capability in the context of director age. So we try to overlay the age of a director in an IT company with what that company does. And the reason being is I thought it's quite interesting to see whether some of the newer technologies, and I'm using sort of air quotes there, impacts director's age because people have recently set up companies or younger people are dealing with those sort of companies. And it sort of bore out, not dramatically, but it was quite an interesting sort of shift to the left. So average director age, 49 years old. Average age of people who mentioned Google, 45 years old. Average age of companies who mentioned WordPress, 44 years old. Now, there's only so far you can take this, and just mentioning a company on your website rather than diving into the detail of partnerships, etc., is an indicator of something, but nothing too detailed. But the interesting thing was, I thought that from a WordPress perspective, clearly a lot of the IT industry in web design uses things like WordPress. And when you come out of college or university and you're trying to get into IT, it's quite a good thing to suddenly start yourself up as a web designer and use things like WordPress and Joomla. So I thought it was relevant to show that actually it is likely that most companies that are involved in WordPress services have a younger director age, because people who just come out of university are likely to be in that sort of shape. And the shape of the curve sort of supports that, albeit on smaller numbers. So, that was quite an interesting bit of work. I'm not sure what it actually proves. So I talked about accreditation. So right at the start, I mentioned that we looked at lots of different things, and it's really interesting to see that GDPR is the most used phrase on websites. Now, these numbers, again, are a product of the 35,000 suppliers. So 4.83 thousand of the 35,000 use the phrase GDPR somewhere on the website. And when you think about it, it's probably in their privacy terms. They're probably saying we conform to GDPR as part of their contact form. So, maybe not such a great shake. And if you take it to that degree, then surely all 35,000 should probably say something like that. But putting that to one side, it's the most prominent phrase based on the list of accreditations that we came up with. If you skip down the list a little bit, Microsoft Partner, Microsoft Gold Partner, Microsoft Silver Partner, big occurrences through the course of the 35,000 companies. And Microsoft Partner is more prominent than Google Partner. So sort of disproves some of the stuff we mentioned previously, that actually Google partners are fewer than Microsoft partners based on people's web text. And if you start driving into that a little bit more, if you look at Microsoft Gold Partner, there's about 530 people who use the phrase Microsoft Gold Partner on their websites. Now, I don't know if there's 530 Microsoft Gold Partners in the UK. And one of the things I'm going to try and get my head around is, of those mentioning Microsoft Gold Partner, if anyone's making claims that they are a Microsoft Gold Partner when they're not, then that's a bit naughty. So this could be a use for the data going forward to try and flush out which companies are making claims that they aren't in the context of vendor accreditations and partnerships. So that's just one thing that I think could be an interesting byproduct of this as a process. Now, probably very difficult to see on video, but there's a way you can map location data on Power BI. So what I did on the left-hand side, obviously a map of the UK, and each little blue dot shows an IT company that exists in the UK. And you can see normal distribution, lots of people around London, down the M3 corridor, through the Midlands around Birmingham, and around sort of Glasgow and Edinburgh in Scotland. No real major surprises in terms of where the suppliers that we scraped live. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Big chunk round Poole for some reason, but again, the fair distribution of what goes on. The point I'm trying to make by the second map is just seeing if there's any. I was trying to draw out if there's any relationship between location and specific vendors or specific technologies. And I picked on IBM. I'm an ex-IBM employee. I'm very proud of my IBM heritage and fundamentally know a lot about the way the IBM works. And the IBM channel, I thought, was pretty centric around some of the IBM offices. And the biggest IBM office used to be the North Harbour office, which is in Portsmouth. So I tried to work out if there's a focus of partners around a Portsmouth region. And without zooming in too much, you'll be able to notice at the bottom of this map, there's a few blue dots, quite a lot of blue dots around the Southampton and Portsmouth area, which is where I live, by stark contrast around here. And this is a relative heat map. So, the 35,000 companies here, not a very big portion of them between Southampton and Portsmouth, but of the, I think it's about 1,000 IBM partners or IBM companies that mention IBM on their website, there's a significant portion that are in the M27 corridor, the Southampton to Portsmouth region. So I think this is quite interesting just to try and ascertain, does location of a vendor's headquarters drive behaviour? And clearly in this instance, I think there are a lot of IBM partners around the Portsmouth area because people have left IBM and started up on their own, or they've moved their businesses to this area to be closer to the mothership. So interesting that you can do this sort of analysis, and I think there's a lot further we can take this, looking at different locations for different skill sets. Final couple of slides. I asked on LinkedIn a few weeks ago if anyone wanted to search the data for any specific phrases. But again, probably quite difficult to see. No major surprises here. I'd look for the term cloud. Of the 15.3 million pages, 3.1 million have the word cloud on it. Clearly, it's a big topic, and it's also very broad, so very applicable. 2 million make the claim that they're part of innovation. So I think that's less interesting. I think for people to say they're part of an innovation curve or applying innovation to their website, that feels a little bit like marketing buzzwords to me rather than actual genuine innovation. And then you get into some of the general industry trends. AI and artificial intelligence I search for individually because they're interchangeable phrases. The phrase AI is more popular than the fully qualified artificial intelligence phrase. So about 849,000 people, pages, mentioned AI, 453,000 mentioned artificial intelligence. Cybersecurity, 555, you can read this for yourself. I think the interesting thing here is I thought blockchain would be bigger. Blockchain only represents about 290,000 pages of the 15 million. And the other thing I learned as part of this process, which is probably nothing to do with the data and more to do with my naivety about how some of this technology works, the phrase disruption and disruptive came back with exactly the same number of hits. And I was trying to work out why that was the case. And it transpires that the search engine that I was using does do some stemming. So it turns disruptive or disrupted or disrupting and disruption into one thing. And on that basis, that clearly it helps with the search side of things, but it means that some of these searches that I'm doing could be influenced by that overview. Appreciate we're in difficult times. There is I didn't do a specific search on the graph, but for interest, COVID of the web scrape that I did was mentioned 2.4 million times out of 15.3. Coronavirus only just less than a million. So COVID has clearly become the best way to articulate what's going on with the virus. So conclusions. I think this data has a value. I don't really want to extract the value in the context of some of the things I'm saying here, but there are some options that projects that people could use to get this sort of data useful. Firstly, vendors, mentioned before, if someone's saying they're a gold partner and they're not, they need to have a process to police that. And obviously web scraping or those sorts of things could be used for that sort of policing. And similarly, if you wanted to try and understand targets for certifications, if you find someone who's only a silver partner, then you could potentially target them for increasing their skill sets in that context. Similarly, distribution, I think it'd be useful for distribution to understand of their vendor customers, sorry, of their supplier customers, which vendors do they support. So trying to understand a broader view of a partner based on their websites and their claims on the website. The actual suppliers themselves, you could use this sort of data to try and understand who your competitors are, who potential acquisition targets are. I've put a made-up SQL statement beneath that. There's lots of ways you can cut this data to try and get a better view of what's going on in the market. Again, you need to be very careful about how you produce this data, but fundamentally, there is potentially a project there that could be had by a channel partner to help them understand this. And finally, my interest is who are the companies that you could use as a buyer for certain products and services that you want to source. And so, the local smaller options or improved services, rather than just looking at the guys who can afford big Google AdWords who've got big brands. Or if you've got some specific niche skills you're trying to find that it's too difficult to find through the Google mire, this sort of thing could be useful. Clearly, I have no interest in selling this data per se, but I think there is some value in a project that might use this sort of data going forward. And I'm going to explore that on a commercial basis at some stage in the future. So, in final slide terms, I have bitten a significant and complex project off here. I think when I started, I made the assumption that there would be a lot less people, suppliers to look at, a lot less web pages to look at, and I've been blown away by the complexity of this, and clearly need some bigger infrastructure to support some of the things I'm doing. A query generally takes 3 days to run, to give you an idea of scale for a complex query. So if you're looking at fixing your database across such a large portion of data, it can take a very long time. And so lesson 1, don't make a typing mistake at the start and then 3 days later realise you've cocked it up. And the other one is, if you leave your PC on and your boys jump on and start playing Fortnite on your PC, then there's a risk they switch it off halfway through. The other thing, I was pretty new to the world of APIs at the start of this, but now I've learned, they're a massive source of data, and more people who open up their data through APIs to the internet is fantastic. And some of the things you can do with them are really quite incredible. The issue you've got to bear in mind is that it's consumption-based costing. So if you are looking to use APIs that are chargeable, it's very, very easy to go over budget, and you need to keep an eye on what you're spending. I think the other thing is, data at this scale is difficult. Getting clean and useful data from a general web trawl is quite difficult. The internet is full of rubbish, and trying to pick the rubbish out, or the quality out from the rubbish is quite a significant process and time mover. And I've spent 6 months playing with this data, so I think it's interesting trying to get to that point. The other thing is that the internet, by definition, is massive. Loads of volume, not much quality. So I'll put here lots of bullshit, apologies for my French. But fundamentally, you need to be really careful of what you're looking at. The big data companies that are getting this right are awesome in my eyes. There is a lot of complexity here, and there are a number of companies that do this for a living. It's just incredible what you can do. And I think with the right tools and techniques and more advanced tooling than I've got, you can do some really interesting things with data. So it's definitely an area that I'm going to continue to play with, just to learn a bit more about it and work out how it works. And then the thing about the market, I think in real terms, it's quite difficult to get trends and themes out of the data I've got, because the market is so obscure. Having 353,000 companies that do IT makes it impossible to navigate. So there is some value in trying to help buyers find the right company for specific needs. And I'm going to continue with that through the directory, because I think that's all part of the value. But anyway, so that's been a long presentation with a lot of graphs in it, and I appreciate you getting to the end if you have got to the end. Got any questions, please get in touch. My website is www.embedded-it.co.uk. By all means, come through the inquiries line and one of us will pick up the inquiry. Very keen to explore this a bit further. If anyone's got any other comments or feedback, please let me know. Cheers.